Good evening and welcome to the YouTube channel. My name is Andrew Mallett and we're going to take a look this time at importing a demonstration Linux VM into Citrix XenServer and then seeing how we use LVM management in CentOS. So in this video we're going to take a look at combining some of the Citrix technologies, XenServer, and their free downloadable Linux virtual machines, and what we've been looking at recently with some of our LVM management. So if I go to my XenCenter console and import the virtual machine, we can browse through to where I've stored it and we can see the XVA file. If you want to download these are free to download, but you will need a login account to Citrix. But you can go to the product download page for XenServer and then we can see the downloadable Linux virtual machine, or the demo Linux virtual machine. This is based around CentOS, so is free to use from both a Citrix perspective and of course the Linux perspective. When I then look at adding this in, I want it to connect to the external world. This is just running through importing the virtual machine into my XenServer environment. Now the virtual machine is relatively small, so it doesn't take a long time to import, and if I move across to it I can then go to the console and we can see now that it's starting up and it's just checking for its IP address. So it's on my external network, so it should be able to pick up a DHCP delivered address. As we can see, it's now prompting for a password. This is obviously a demonstration virtual machine, so I suppose they could supply us the password, but if we want to use it in our own environment, we of course need to set our own password. So as we run through this little wizard, it will only prompt me this once. I'll set up my password and of course enter it twice, try and get it correct. So now we can log in as our configured user account. Again, as always, I can use the Control and L screen to clear the screen, and if I look at uname -r, we can see that we're using the 2.6.18 kernel here. Of course, it's the Xen based kernel because we're running paravirtualized within our XenServer environment. If I look at the mount command, so you can see we've currently then just got the single disk XVDA that hasn't been partitioned up. The whole disk is then mounted as our root file system, and if I run then the df-h, we can see then that we've got 3.6 gig available and 10% is being used. Now we were looking before at SUSE Linux and how we can use LVMs. Well, it's more or less the same within most distributions, but of course we'll just now take a look at it within this distribution. So the first thing I'm going to do, obviously my whole disk space is occupied at the moment, XVDA, don't have any partitions to use, so I'll add in a new disk. So moving through to the storage tab, I can add new storage, so I could call it then demo Linux virtual machine disk 2. Choose a size, 1 gig's just enough. Once I've got that then set, I can go back to my console. If I do an fdisk -l, we can list the disk and we can see that this has then been detected as Xen Virtual Disk C. So again, I'll clear the screen with Control and L, and now we're going to run through and start to use this as a physical volume, and then create our volume group, and then create our logical volumes, so we can use dynamically expanding disks across a collection of disks rather than being restricted just to the one disk. So of course we start off with pv create to mark it as in use, pv create /dev /xen virtual disk C. Now of course that should be dev. So that's marked it as being in use or usable by our logical volume system. We now create our volume group, so vg create, give it a name, so we can call it volume group 1, and we're going to include then /dev /xvdc. We can run the command vgs to see then the volume group, and we can see we've got one physical volume with that, and that's giving me then the rough gigabyte of free space. We now go through and run the lv create. So set a name, so we can call it, say, data, its size, so -L, and we'll just have 500 meg, and we're going to use volume group 1. Again, I can then look at LV scan or LVS, and we can see now that data is active and is 500 megs in size. So of course this is just our logical volume. We haven't yet got a file system, so we have to make our file system. So we can use muckfs, so ext, and we can see we've got available here, so ext2, ext3, and then /dev /vg1 /data. Control and L clears my screen. Enter will then just allow me to format this 500 meg file system. So we can see in much of these instances LVM management doesn't really change. So this is on CentOS. Previously we looked at it on SUSE, but yeah, we can see to an extent it's the same. Control and L again is going to clear my screen. And of course I need this to be mounted. So if I make a directory, so I go muckdir /data. So I've got my data directory now. Having created my data directory, I can mount it. I could mount it directly now, but really I want to do this through the fstab file to make sure anything that I type in the fstab file is going to be syntactically correct, because then I can test it with mount -a, which will load everything that is in the fstab file that should be set for auto mount. So if I go vi /etc /fstab, just copy this line, so I can go yyp, so yy copies the line, a lowercase p pastes it below my current line, and uppercase p would have pasted it above. And we can go through to xvda with this. Then I'm going to hit the I for insert and move back, and it's going to be vg1 / and then data. I want to mount to the data directory. Still the ext3 file system, so I don't need to change that. I don't have to tidy it up, I like it all aligned, it just makes it easier to read. Don't need it included for the dumpfs, it's an older way of backing up, and we will do a file system check, but after the root file system. So with that in place, I can save my changes, so escape : and X for save and exit, and then run the command mount -a, and now mount by itself. We can see that that has been mounted correctly. Again, it shows as the device mapper rather than the device that we use, dev vg1 data, but that is then our device mapped, And again, if we do the df minus h, we can see then that we have our 485 meg free and 11 meg is used by the file system. In SUSE we had to make sure that the boot.lvm service was loaded. The boot LVM is the service that is in SUSE to manage our LVMs, but is LVM to monitor in CentOS. So if I go and have a look, cd/etc/init.d, and then run a listing here. This is a minimal system we've got, so it doesn't have too many services, but you can see one of the services there is LVM2 monitor. We can check that with then service LVM2-monitor, and just to give you an idea, if I try and stop it, this is always running. It says we shouldn't stop it, it's for monitoring our LVMs, and it will mount it. So what we want it to do, not mount it, but we will activate the LVMs on boot. If we have a look again with check config, so chkconfig, and then we run it with minus list for CentOS, and then LVM2 minus monitor, we can see that it's configured for all run levels apart from the stopping and rebooting run levels of 0 and 6. So we don't have to enable it, it is enabled by default, and in fact we have to run forced stop rather than just stop. I suppose I could run a check config minus delete so it wouldn't boot, but you can understand that there's no real need, unless of course we're not running any LVMs. The service isn't constantly running, it only runs on boot to check for LVM systems. With that in place now, we should reboot the machine to double check that it does mount on boot. As we can see during the boot process here, setting up logical volume management, one logical volume found in volume group 1, and that's now been set as active. So that would be the LVM2-monitor that's running, or what we saw in SUSE was the boot.lvm. And then of course log back in as our root user. We haven't configured any additional users. Once we've done that, then let's just run through, clear my screen and look at the mount command. As we scroll down, we can see then we've got our data directory has been mounted through to our LVM. So thank you very much, and I hope you found it useful both from a Citrix point of view, looking at the demonstration virtual machine, but also from a Linux point of view and seeing how similar the commands can be between different distributions. Thank you, and come back soon.